What's gaming, gamers? Have you ever wanted to clear entire rooms of ads while remaining yourself completely free of danger? Have you ever wanted to have a near infinite restoration times 2 uptime? Well, have I got the build for you. This Solar Warlock build takes advantage of the Sunbracers exotic arms armor and the Solar subclass to do just that. This build works best in solo content and is a build I used just recently to solo flawless the Duality dungeon. I've left the link to the Twitch highlight for that run in the description if you want to see this build in action in more detail. Before I get into the build itself, however, I'd like to shout out our clan, the Tyrant Seraphs. If you're looking for people to play any content in Destiny with, ranging from ritual playlist and seasonal activities all the way to raids and Grandmaster strikes, feel free to join the Discord server. We welcome anyone, no matter how new or seasoned you are, and all of us will teach encounters if you don't know something. If you're interested, hop into the Discord server and play some Destiny with us. The link is in the description. Additionally, if you'd like to watch me play games more often, come hang out with me over on Twitch. I usually play whatever game I feel like over there, and I stream Destiny often. Additionally, if you have any questions about builds or build crafting in general, I love answering those. If anything I've said has piqued your interest, the link to my Twitch is in the description as well. To get into the build itself, I'll start with describing the Sunbracers exotic arms armor and what they do in case you're not aware. Sunbracers have the exotic perk Helium Spirals, which increases the duration of the solar-specific grenade entitled Solar Grenade by 4 seconds. Additionally, after having gotten a solar melee kill, you will be granted the Sunbracers Ready buff. While the Sunbracers Ready buff is active, throwing your solar grenade grants you the Sunbracers buff. While this Sunbracers buff is active, your solar grenade is granted a 20,000% increase to its recharge rate for 5 seconds, which effectively recharges 132% of a solar grenade charge every second for that 5-second duration. Lastly, Helium Spirals also grants you the Fastball mod intrinsically, which simply allows you to throw your grenades further. Now that you know what Sunbracers do, I can get into the build itself, starting with the subclass setup. I'll start by putting everything on screen as a prescriptive setup if that's what you prefer. Once I've done that, I'll get into the subclass in more detail, describing what each subclass element does, why I've chosen it, as well as any alternative options should there be any. For the prescriptive subclass setup, first run the Well of Radiance Super. Run the Phoenix Dive class ability, whichever jump you prefer, the Celestial Fire melee, the Solar Grenade, the Heat Rises aspect, the Touch of Flame aspect, Ember of Empyrean, Ember of Resolve, Ember of Singeing, and Ember of Torches. To describe the subclass's setup, firstly, the Well of Radiance Super. Well of Radiance is chosen as effectively a panic button in case you find yourself in dire need of an instant save, but it's also a fantastic utility for damage phases, as it will allow you to focus entirely on dealing damage to the boss instead of having to concurrently worry about ensuring you stay alive. If you wanted, you could use the Daybreak Super instead, but I find Daybreak to be quite underwhelming if you're not also using the Dawn Chorus exotic helmet, so Well of Radiance should be used most of the time with this build. Next, the Phoenix Dive is chosen as it's a very easy source of the Restoration times 2 buff so long as Heat Rises is active. I'll talk more about that synergy specifically later, but the Phoenix Dive also serves as an instant source of 2 stacks to the Cure buff upon its use, making it act as a faster recharging healing grenade. As for which melee ability to use, you can really use either one you want. I prefer Celestial Fire as it allows me the ability to get my melee kill to proc the Sunbracers buff from range, but it can be inconsistent at times and doesn't always reliably track to or kill the enemy you want it to. Incinerator Snap has a faster base cooldown and applies more Scorch stacks overall to targets, suggesting all of the snap projectiles damage the same enemy, so Incinerator Snap can be more consistent overall, but it sacrifices range for that consistency. Overall, it's entirely your choice which melee ability to use, so use both of them and see which one suits you more. Next, the Solar Grenade is chosen as it's the only grenade that's buffed by the Sunbracers exotic arms armor. In combination with the Touch of Flame aspect, the Solar Grenade can be incredibly potent and will serve to deal significant damage to single targets as well as clearing entire rooms of enemies effectively. Onto the aspects, firstly, Heat Rises. Heat Rises is chosen as it will allow you to generate a significant amount of melee energy when getting kills while airborne, proc a burst of the Cure buff even when not using the healing grenade, and allows the Phoenix Dive class ability to grant you the Restoration ×2 buff. It is this Restoration ×2 effect that is the main reason Heat Rises is brought, as this build doesn't make use of the healing grenade, and as such has no other source of Restoration ×2. The melee energy generating capabilities of Heat Rises are also a fantastic utility for this build, and will be taken advantage of a significant amount with this build's combat loop. The second aspect to run is Touch of Flame. Touch of Flame will buff a few of the Solar subclass's grenades, but for this build, the only grenade we care about having been buffed is the Solar Grenade. Touch of Flame increases the base duration of the Solar Grenade's lingering effect from 4 seconds to 6 seconds. This is in addition to the 4-second increase granted by the Sunbracers exotic arms armor, and will grant your Solar Grenades a total linger duration of 10 seconds. Furthermore, Touch of Flame grants your Solar Grenades the ability to spew lava blobs out of the center of the grenade, which deal damage to any enemy hit by the lava blob. Both of these buffs increase the Solar Grenade's damage output significantly, and when combined, the Solar Grenade becomes a legitimate source of damage against mages, elites, and even bosses. Now onto the fragments, firstly Ember of Empyrean. As of update 7.3.5 that just went live on Tuesday, March 5th, Ember of Empyrean was changed. Those changes are reflected in this description. Ember of Empyrean will grant your solar weapons and abilities the ability to extend the duration of both the Radiant and Restoration buffs by a differing amount depending on the tier of enemy killed. Unfortunately, as I'm writing this script before the changes go live, I don't have specific numbers per tier of enemy killed. Furthermore, Ember of Empyrean will allow both the Radiant and Restoration buffs to be extended to a maximum on-screen timer of 15 seconds. The timers for the buffs can be extended to this 15-second maximum indefinitely, but the timer itself cannot exceed 15 seconds on screen. Ember of Empyrean is mostly useful for extending your Restoration ×2 buff indefinitely, and will allow you to heal yourself over time a significant amount. Ember of Empyrean does come with a -10 stat penalty to your Resilience stat, but that's hardly an issue when you'll have an infinite supply of the Restoration ×2 buff. Next, Ember of Resolve will grant you 1 stack of the Cure buff every time your grenades get a kill. This means every time your Solar Grenades kill an enemy, you'll be healed for 30 health on top of having your Restoration ×2 buff extended. This is very helpful for survivability in higher difficulty content, and especially when solo, as having all enemies focused on damaging you at all times can make even Restoration ×2's healing output seem as though it's not enough. Thirdly, for fragments is Ember of Singeing. Ember of Singeing will grant your class ability a 300% increase to its recharge rate for 3 seconds instantly upon applying Scorch to any enemy. Ember of Singeing's 3-second buff timer also acts as its cooldown, and it can't be applied further while it's active. However, once the 3-second timer of the buff has elapsed, it can be instantly procced again, effectively granting you an indefinite 300% increase to your class ability's recharge rate so long as you're scorching enemies. Lastly, for fragments is Ember of Torches. Ember of Torches will instantly grant you the Radiant buff for 8 seconds upon damaging an enemy with your powered melee attack. This is incredibly helpful for your outgoing weapon damage, as the Radiant buff will cause your weapons to deal 25% increased damage while active. Furthermore, having the Radiant buff procced will allow your weapons to pierce barrier champion shields, as well as most of the other combatant shields in the game, so long as your weapons don't already have a different anti-champion mod active. Ember of Torches does lower your discipline stat by 10 points, but this isn't a problem as this build doesn't rely on the discipline stat at all for its grenade spam capabilities. Now, if you're watching this video during Season 23, the Season of the Wish, this season's artifact is incredibly well suited for becoming Radiant without the use of Ember of Torches. And with Ember of Empyrean, all you need to do is proc Radiant once using the artifact, and you can keep that buff active indefinitely so long as you kill enemies with solar weapons or abilities. As this is the case, if you're playing during Season 23, you can swap out the Ember of Torches fragment for Ember of Searing. Ember of Searing will simply work in tandem with the Heat Rises aspect to grant you even more melee energy upon defeating targets. Except, unlike Heat Rises requiring airborne kills to grant melee energy, Ember of Searing requires the defeat of scorched targets. This build will be scorching targets often, and as such will proc Ember of Searing frequently. Furthermore, Ember of Searing will generate fire sprites upon the defeat of scorched targets, and it will also grant you a 10-point increase to your recovery stat. Speaking of the seasonal artifact, I'll now describe what artifact mods you should run with this build if you're watching this video during Season 23, the Season of the Wish. This season's artifact is very well suited for the Solar subclass and will act as a fantastic addition to this build especially. In the second column, pick up the Kindling Trigger mod to allow your solar weapons to apply Scorch to enemies who aren't currently scorched so long as you're radiant. This will be a great utility for proccing the Ember of Singeing fragment, further ensuring you constantly have your Phoenix Dive class ability off of cooldown. In the third column, firstly, the Flint Striker mod will cause rapid solar weapon precision hits and final blows to grant you the Radiant buff for 10 seconds. This duration can then be extended by Ember of Empyrean, allowing you to proc and continue to have the Radiant buff without the use of Ember of Torches. This is the mod that frees up that fragment slot to allow you to use the Ember of Searing fragment if you decide to. Next in the third column, the Heart of the Flame mod is a great passive utility for use with this build. Heart of the Flame will grant you the Radiant buff for 10 seconds upon the casting of your Well of Radiance, which can be helpful if you aren't radiant when you cast your well. Obviously, the damage increase granted by Heart of the Flame isn't at all useful with the Well of Radiance, but this mod is otherwise a great passive bonus for being granted the Radiant buff. In the fourth column, the Revitalizing Blast mod is incredibly useful for this build's boss damaging potential. Revitalizing Blast will cause your solar abilities to apply the Void Weaken debuff to bosses and champions damaged by said abilities for 6 seconds, which causes those enemies to take 15% increased damage from all sources for the Weaken debuff's duration. This is a great utility for increasing both your own and your fire team's damage against bosses and champions, and as such should be brought. Finally, in the fifth column, the Rays of Precision mod will cause any precision final blow acquired while radiant to cause that enemy to ignite. This is a fantastic mod for crowd controlling groups of enemies, as all you'll need to do is get a precision kill on one of them and they'll all explode due to the ignition. Lastly, as this build works best while solo, the Solo Operative mod should always be chosen. Solo Operative simply increases all outgoing damage by 15% so long as you're the only member of your fire team. With the seasonal artifact now detailed, I'll get into the armor setup for use with this build. I'll start by detailing my recommendations for stat distribution. Once I've done that, I'll put a prescriptive armor mod setup on screen, and once that's been done, I'll detail the armor mod setup describing what each mod does, why I've chosen them, as well as any alternative mod options should there be any. As for stat distribution, in the top 3 stat grouping of Mobility, Resilience, and Recovery, the only stat you need to spec into is Resilience. Mobility, as always, is unimportant on a Warlock, and Recovery will be negligible for this build, as Ember of Singeing will be the main source of class ability regeneration, and Restoration times 2 will be this build's main source of healing. As for the bottom 3 stat grouping of Discipline, Intellect, and Strength, Strength is the only stat worth speccing heavily into, as the melee ability is the only important ability to have off cooldown as often as possible. Discipline doesn't matter, as the Sunbracers exotic arms armor will grant significant grenade energy, and Intellect will be unimportant, as this build will be actively generating super energy very quickly. My armor stats have me at 30 Mobility, 103 Resilience, 41 Recovery, 26 Discipline, 51 Intellect, and 101 Strength. Now onto the armor's mod setup. I'll first put everything on screen as a prescriptive setup if that's what you prefer, and once I've done that, I'll detail what each mod does, why I've chosen it, as well as any alternative options should there be any. On your helmet, run 1 Ashes to Assets mod, 1 Harmonic Siphon mod, and 1 Heavy Ammo Finder mod. On your arms, run 1 Bolstering Detonation mod, 1 Firepower mod, and 1 Focusing Strike mod. On your chest piece, simply use whatever resistance mods you need for the content you'll be running. On your legs, run 1 Recuperation mod and 2 Solar Weapon Surge mods. Lastly, on your bond, run 1 Reaper mod and 1 Time Dilation mod. To describe the armor's mod setup, firstly, the helmet's mods. The Ashes to Assets mod will grant you increased super energy upon getting kills with your grenades, which this build will be doing quite often. This is just a little bit of extra Well of Radiance energy to ensure you have your well off cooldown when you need it. Next, the Harmonic Siphon mod will cause your solar weapons to generate an orb of power upon getting multi-kills with them. These orbs of power will be useful for multiple purposes, including super energy, armor charge, as well as health and ability energy. Lastly, the Heavy Ammo Finder will grant you the ability to summon vastly more heavy ammo than you otherwise would be able to, especially if using the Sunshot exotic hand cannon, but I'll talk more about weapon choice later in the video. Having more heavy ammo is incredibly helpful for solo play especially, as you'll be able to deal damage more effectively during damage phases with more ammo at your disposal. Next, on your arms, the Bolstering Detonation mod will grant your Phoenix Dive 9.6% energy upon dealing damage with your grenade ability on a 7-second cooldown. This 7-second cooldown means that you can only be granted this 9.6% energy once every 7 seconds, but each individual solar grenade has a 10-second linger duration and as such can proc Bolstering Detonation twice so long as it deals damage at the beginning and the end of the grenade's lifespan. Next, the Firepower mod will cause your grenade final blows to generate an orb of power. Unfortunately, with the recent changes to the Firepower mod, Firepower can only be procced once every 10 seconds, making it a less than stellar option, but it is a free orb of power every 10 seconds and will ensure your grenades aren't stealing orb-generating kills from your solar weapons. Lastly, the Focusing Strike mod will grant you 9.6% class ability energy upon dealing damage with your powered melee attack, which you'll be doing often to proc Sunbracers. Similarly to Bolstering Detonation, Focusing Strike has an intrinsic 7-second cooldown, but this cooldown is separate from Bolstering Detonations. In addition to the instant boost of class ability energy granted by both Bolstering Detonation and Focusing Strike, both your melee ability and grenade ability will apply Scorch to enemies damaged by them, which will proc the Ember of Singeing Fragment to grant your class ability a 300% increase to its recharge rate. Next, on your chest piece, simply running whatever resistance mods you need for the content you'll be running will suffice. I find myself generally running one Arc, one Solar, and one Void resistance mod, but I do swap to 2 of one specific affinity resistance mod if there's a threat modifier in the activity I'll be playing. When there is, I'll swap to 2 resistance mods that correspond to the affinity of the activity's threat modifier. There aren't any other mods that you need to run on the chest piece, so run whatever combination of resistance mods is suitable for the content you'll be playing. Onto the mods on your legs, firstly, the Recuperation mod will grant you 70 health upon the collection of any orb of power with no cooldown. This makes the collection of orbs of power significantly safer, as well as causing orbs of power themselves to act as effective healing wells, which is a fantastic utility to have in higher difficulty or solo content. Next, the 2 Solar Weapon Surge mods will grant your solar weapons a 17% boost to all outgoing damage while you have any stacks of armor charge. Having 2 Solar Weapon Surges equipped is a 70% damage increase over just having 1 Solar Weapon Surge mod equipped, so it's very much so worthwhile to have 2 of the Solar Surges equipped over just 1. Lastly, for your Bonds mods, the Reaper mod will cause your next weapon final blow within 10 seconds of having used your class ability to summon an orb of power. Reaper has a 10-second cooldown between activations with only 1 mod equipped, meaning you can only be granted its orb of power once every 10 seconds, but you'll rarely have your class ability off cooldown more than once every 10 seconds anyways, so this cooldown is negligible. Lastly, the Time Dilation mod will cause your decaying armor charge stacks to last 15 seconds instead of 10 seconds each, which is a 50% increase to the total duration of your armor charge. This is a significant boost to your armor charge's uptime, and by extension, your solar weapon surge uptime, which will help your weapons deal 17% extra damage for much longer than normal. If you'd prefer, you can swap the Reaper mod out for a second Time Dilation mod, but this only increases each stack of armor charge's decay timer to 18 seconds instead of 15 seconds with just 1 Time Dilation equipped. This is a 60% increase to the extension of time granted by Time Dilation, but I find the Orb of Power granted by the Reaper mod to be more useful overall, so I prefer to run the Reaper mod. However, that option is there for you if you'd like. With the armor setup now entirely detailed, I can get into my recommendations for weapon choice. I'll first describe legendary weapons I recommend using in the kinetic slot, then the energy slot, and finally, I'll detail a few power weapons I recommend using with this build. After I've detailed legendary weapons from each slot that I recommend using, I'll describe a few exotic weapons that work very well with this build in each of the 3 slots. In the kinetic slot, I recommend running a special ammo weapon, as it'll help deal extra damage to bosses if you're out of heavy ammo, as well as being a high burst damage option for dealing with majors and mini-bosses whom you need to dispatch of quickly, but don't want to use heavy ammo on. Furthermore, weapons with perks like Chill Clip or Slice are great options, as they'll apply stasis or strand debuffs respectively to enemies, which will allow you to deal more damage to those enemies while radiant due to the Torch Artifact mod. As for specific weapons I recommend using in the kinetic slot, there are the Riptide Stasis Fusion Rifle from the Crucible weapon pool with the perk combination of Autoloading Holster and Chill Clip, the Scatter Signal Strand Fusion Rifle from the Season of the Wish with the perk combination of Controlled Burst and Slice, the Lingering Dread Stasis Grenade Launcher from the Duality Dungeon with the perk combination of Autoloading Holster and Chill Clip, and the Supremacy Kinetic Sniper Rifle from the Last Wish raid with the perk combination of 4th times the Charm and Rewind rounds. Onto the energy slot, running a solar primary ammo weapon in this slot is highly recommended. It'll benefit heavily from the solar weapon surge mods in your legs, as well as this season's artifact, on top of being able to more consistently proc your solar fragments and generate you melee ability energy than a solar special ammo weapon would. As for specific weapons I recommend using, there are the Adhortative Solar Pulse Rifle from the Season of the Wish with the perk combination of Heal Clip and Incandescent, the BXR-55 Battler Solar Pulse Rifle from Dares of Eternity with the perk combination of Incandescent and Pugilist, the Callus Mini-Tool Submachine Gun from the Season of the Haunted, currently acquirable from the Presage Exotic Mission with the perk combination of Incandescent and Threat Detector, and the Zowli's Bane Solar Hand Cannon from the King's Fall raid with the perk combination of Explosive Payload and Incandescent. Lastly, for the heavy slot, I generally prefer to run either a rocket launcher or a linear fusion rifle with this build, as they'll deal vast amounts of damage to majors, champions, and bosses alike. The rest of this build is entirely designed around ad clearing, so running a machine gun in your heavy slot is not recommended. Additionally, running a solar weapon is something I'd highly recommend, as they'll also benefit from the 17% damage boost granted by the 2 solar weapon surge mods slotted in your legs. As for specific heavy weapons I recommend using, there are the Apex Predator Solar Rocket Launcher from the Last Wish raid with the perk combination of Bait and Switch and Reconstruction, the Ascendancy Solar Rocket Launcher, which is purchasable from the Monument to Lost Lights in the Tower, with the perk combination of Explosive Light and Impulse Amplifier, the Briar's Contempt Solar Linear Fusion Rifle from the Root of Nightmares raid, with the perk combination of High Impact Reserves and Rewind rounds, and the Cataclysmic Solar Linear Fusion Rifle from the Vow of the Disciple raid, with the perk combination of Bait and Switch and 4th times the Charm. Now, I am aware that 3 of the 4 heavy weapons I've just recommended are raid weapons, and not everybody has access to raids or fire teams with which to raid to acquire these weapons. There are 2 ways around this, however. Firstly, the Ascendancy Rocket Launcher, purchasable from the Monument to Lost Lights in the Tower, is a fantastic rocket launcher. Plus, as of update 7.3.5 released on March 5th, had its frame receive a buff which increased its total ammo reserves by 2 rockets, and its overall damage penalty reduced from 10% to 5%. This has made Ascendancy an even better option for those who are unable to raid, and its best role is purchasable by everybody from the Monuments to Lost Lights in the Tower, as it was the ritual weapon during the Season of the Lost. Additionally, you can join our clan's Discord server, whose link is in the description, and run some raids with us. We raid often, and all of us are willing to help newer people learn the raids or dungeons to get weapons that have been gatekept from them. Next, I'll go over a few exotic weapons that I'd recommend using with this build. I won't go over them in too much detail, as this video is already getting pretty long, but I'll give you a few options in each slot. In the kinetic slot, both the Conditional Finality Stasis and Solar Exotic Shotgun from the Root of Nightmares raid, and the Navigator Exotic Strand Trace Rifle from the Ghosts of the Deep Dungeon are great options for use with this build. Conditional Finality will both apply a stasis debuff to enemies in the form of freezing them, proccing the Torch Artifact mod for you, as well as igniting enemies with its second shot, which will help synergize with your Solar subclass. Additionally, Conditional Finality just deals a large amount of damage, and as such is a great option for dealing with majors, champions, and bosses alike. Next, the Navigator Trace Rifle is simply brought this season as a weapon that can apply the Sever debuff to targets, which will also proc the Torch Artifact mod, allowing your solar weapons to deal more damage to that enemy so long as you're radiant. Overall, I wouldn't generally recommend running an exotic weapon in your kinetic slot, as the best exotic for use with this build is in your energy slot in the form of the Sunshot exotic hand cannon. Put simply and succinctly, this gun is insane. Sunshot will absolutely serve as a powerhouse for use with this build, and as you've been seeing in the gameplay footage in the background, makes short work of all enemies in the game. If you don't have Sunshot, you can also use the Tiku's Divination Solar Exotic Bow, or the Vex Mythoclast Solar Exotic Fusion Rifle, but any of the legendary weapons I described a few minutes ago are also on par with Tiku's and Vex. Lastly, for the heavy slot, if you don't have or otherwise aren't using the Sunshot hand cannon, there are the Dragon's Breath Exotic Solar Rocket Launcher and the Xenophage Exotic Solar Machine Gun. Dragon's Breath is a very set and forget weapon, allowing you to shoot a boss to proc ignitions on them while you deal damage to adds, while Xenophage outputs a fantastic amount of damage onto majors, champions, and bosses alike, especially with double solar weapon surge mods. As I said, however, my number one recommendation for exotic weapon to use with this build is the Sunshot exotic hand cannon. If you don't have Sunshot, get Sunshot and use it. I promise you won't regret it. With the entire build now detailed, I'll get into some playstyle tips and tricks for you to use when running this build. Firstly, proc heat rises and stay airborne as often as possible. Not only will enemies have a harder time hitting you, but you'll also generate plenty of melee energy to keep your Sunbracers procced consistently. Speaking of Sunbracers, I find it best to only throw 4 grenades after having procced the Sunbracers buff instead of the maximum of 5. If you throw all 5 grenades, you won't have a grenade to proc heat rises again if you need it, which also acts as a source of the cure buff to heal you. As this is the case, it's best practice to proc Sunbracers and then throw 4 solar grenades, ensuring you keep one fully charged at all times in case you need it to proc heat rises again, or to deal that little bit of extra damage to an enemy. Lastly, for tips, when running this build in a group, especially with other people running Sunbracers themselves, try to call out what enemies you'll be using your melee ability on. It can be incredibly detrimental to lose out on a Sunbracers proc if the enemy you've used your melee ability on dies before the melee even hits them, so try to be communicative with your fire team if possible to ensure that happens as infrequently as possible. But that's all for this video. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video and would like to see more Destiny content in the future, consider subscribing to my YouTube channel and following me on Twitch. Additionally, if you'd like to join our clan, the Tyrant Seraphs, I've left a link to our Discord server in the description below, so join that and come play some Destiny with us. If you have any questions or constructive criticisms, please leave them in the comments. I read all of them and reply to all that I can. Thank you again for watching, and have a great day.